This is World History of Christianity, Chapter 12, Part 4, page 494. History textbooks throughout the 20th century have perpetuated the idea that Darwin's arguments, usually presented as the discovery of an objective truth rather than the presentation of a scientific hypothesis, dealt an immediate blow to the credibility of the Christian churches. The symbolic moment of the supposed triumph of progressive science over backward religion is invariably cited as having taken place at a meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science, which was held in Oxford in 1860. This famous meeting, at which papers by the natural scientist Charles Daubeny on the final causes of the sexuality of plants, with particular reference to Mr. Darwin's work on the origin of species, and by the chemist John William Draper on the intellectual development of Europe, considered with reference to the views of Mr. Darwin, were read, was important because it allowed Darwin's theories to be presented to a mixed audience of theologians and scientists. Since Darwin was too ill to attend, an aspiring scientist called Thomas Huxley defended his views, while attacks upon them were led by a more established figure, the natural scientist Samuel Wilberforce. Because T.H. Huxley, who in 1869 coined the term agnostic to describe his intellectual position, was already an avowed religious skeptic, and Samuel Wilberforce was an Anglican bishop, it was easy for the discussion to be presented afterwards as a symbolic battle between obscurantist religion and objective science. The clinching moment of the debate was supposed to have come when Wilberforce asked Huxley whether he would claim an ape for his ancestor, at which Huxley was reported to have whispered, "The Lord hath delivered him into my hands," before retorting to tumultuous applause that he would prefer to be descended from an ape than from a bishop who used his talents and influence to obscure the truth. Although something approximating to the notorious exchange between Wilberforce and Huxley undoubtedly occurred, neither its symbolic importance nor the outcome of the debate seemed so clear-cut at the time. Eyewitnesses, none of whom could recall the precise wording of the exchange, evidently understood the subject under discussion to be the scientific validity of Darwin's theories, not their theological implications. Furthermore, if anyone emerged as the clear winner of the debate, it was Wilberforce rather than Huxley. The earliest known reporting of the meeting concluded that the most eminent naturalists assembled at Oxford supported Wilberforce, while most members of the audience bestowed bitter looks of hatred on Huxley, who they felt had treated the bishop abominably. Even Darwin admitted that the review of the origin of species, which Wilberforce afterwards published, picked out with skill all the most conjectural parts and brought forward well all the difficulties of his argument. Nor did the pro-Darwinian minority have better scientific credentials than the anti-Darwinians. Perhaps the most prominent member to be convinced by Huxley was the liberal theologian and contributor to Essays and Reviews, Frederick Temple. Although there seems little historical evidence to support the claim of T.H. Huxley's son Leonard in 1903 that the Oxford debate represented not merely the contradiction of one anatomist by another, but the open clash between science and the church, this is the version of the debate which has passed into modern folklore. Reasons for later interpretations of the significance of the Oxford debate seem to have had less to do with Darwin's science and the church's immediate reactions to it than with the anti-clerical position of some who found his theories potentially congenial to their cause. The paper which Draper presented to the same meeting of the association, for example, argued that science was the progressive force which had guided Western civilization forward, despite the repeated opposition of reactionary churches. The moral was one which advocates of liberalism were quick to seize. Subsequent works, like Draper's highly influential History of the Intellectual Development of Europe, 1862, and History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science, 1875, further expanded on what was to become a familiar model of the supposed warfare between science and religion, one in which Darwin began to be presented as a martyr to scientific truth. The notion that the natural sciences, now significantly called science, held the key to certain knowledge and human progress was to be aggressively publicized in the latter years of the 19th century and broadly accepted by most Europeans over the course of the 20th. As anti-clericals increasingly appealed not only to the familiar Enlightenment rallying cries of rationality and progress to defend their positions, but to something like scientific determinism as the final arbiter of intellectual and spiritual disagreements, science began to be described in a semi-mystical light and to be championed by anti-clerical liberals with all the fervor of a new religion. John Tyndall, who declared prophetically at a meeting of the British Association held at Belfast in 1874 that science had already to some extent leavened the world and would continue to leaven it more and more, was matched in his confidence by T.H. Huxley, whose aptly named lay sermons preached liberalism, Darwinism, and scientific progressivism to packed halls throughout the British Isles. In Germany, racist interpretations of Darwinism, like those which were propounded in the English-speaking world by Herbert Spencer, were preached with particular fervor by Ernest Haeckel. In France, where The Origin of Species had been translated into French by Clemence Royer in 1862, Darwinism was taken up by the Third Republic to justify the purging of clerical opinion from universities and to establish the importance of modern and scientific education for the nation. The Enlightenment, which had been disparaged for nearly a century as the quintessential age of shallow thinking and superficial understandings of religious truth, now began to be reclaimed by historians, scientists, and politicians alike as an important chapter in the steady march of progress from the superstitions of a so-called primitive age towards the bright future of scientific knowledge and technological advancement. This new scientist creed, which drew upon the positivist arguments of Auguste Comte, that all knowledge passed through primitive stages of theological and metaphysical understandings before finally arriving at scientific or positive knowledge, was deeply flattering to those who believed that 19th century knowledge surpassed that of all other historical periods. It also offered a convenient anti-clerical weapon with which to justify the increasing dominance of a liberal intellectual elite. That Darwin's theories were valued more for what they seemed to claim for modern Western civilization than for their contribution to biology seems evident from the bewildering array of arguments which they were afterwards claimed to support. Marxism, laissez-faire capitalism, racist theories, or social Darwinism and nationalism, among many other often mutually exclusive philosophies, all came to be justified through their supposed promotion of the survival of the fittest, as well as appearing to lend support to a wide variety of 19th and 20th century ideologies. The popular notion that Darwin had disproved the Bible was to convince many that the authority of something called science was weightier than the authority of something called religion. Pluralism and diffusion. Widespread doubts as to the possibility of a secure future for Christian society began to be expressed from about the 1880s in ways which were to become all too familiar in the 20th century. Clergymen and other committed Christians complained that fewer people especially middle-class men and working people of both sexes, were turning up for weekly Sunday services. The poor were said to be shockingly ignorant of Christian doctrine and often no better than pagans in their attachment to superstitious beliefs and practices. The fear that they might be seduced away from the faith by the secular creeds of socialism, materialism, and communism seemed increasingly acute. The preaching of the main churches was thought by some to be doctrinally suspect, and the atmosphere of a Sunday less reverent. Established churches, faced with intense interdenominational competition as well as rival forms of belief, appeared to be struggling harder to retain the loyalty of their nominal members, many of whom had lost the habit of regular church attendance and seemed to prefer to spend their leisure hours in cafes, music halls, and theaters, or else taking part in newly popular sports like football, cricket, or bicycling. Agnostic, materialist, and positivist opinions, which circulated freely in newspapers, learned journals, novels, and political pamphlets, seemed to be espoused by people in all walks of life, from the proletarian to the bourgeois, and were said to be rife in many European universities. In addition to what seemed to many to be the secularizing effects of modern and particularly urban life, the institutional churches appeared to be becoming politically marginal. In Italy, Catholic welfare organizations had been secularized. In France, Republicans had restored divorce to the civil code, allowed work on Sundays, removed prayers from the opening of national assemblies, and insisted that priests be considered eligible for military service. The Anglican Church, although still established in England, had lost its status in Ireland and its practical monopoly in Wales, and despite valiant attempts to reach the slums of the great industrial cities, appeared to leave most working people cold. In Germany, the intransigence of a majority firmly established evangelical Landeskirchen towards adapting to theological liberalism and even to moderate forms of socialism left them open to the charge of representing little more than an ideology for conservatives. The sense that society was becoming more secular was not restricted to the social and political developments. The work of scholars in a number of academic disciplines appeared to cast doubt on the exclusivity and objectivity of the Christian message by suggesting that religions were merely social and cultural artifacts, and therefore legitimate subjects for scrutiny by social scientists. Almost no one went as far as Friedrich Nietzsche, retired as professor in philology at Basel, who argued in On the Genealogy of Morals, 1887, that the so-called Christian virtues were not only historically conditioned, but motivated by the resentment of the weak for the strong. But arguments which stressed the contingency of religious beliefs were being voiced in a number of newly confident disciplines from about the turn of the century. The conclusions of early anthropologists like E.B. Taylor and James Frazer, who attempted to account for the existence of common features in all religions, could be taken to imply that the Christian faith was nothing more than an evolved form of superstitious magic. Frazer's immensely influential The Golden Bough, A Study in Magic and Religion, 1890, like Emile Durkheim's sociological study of Aboriginal totemism in Elementary Forms of the Religious Life, 1912, treated the sacred beliefs of primitive people with an apparent reductionism, which was soon to be applied to the origins of Christian beliefs as well. The works of the linguist Max Mueller, who did more than anyone to present the sacred texts of Buddhism and Hinduism to the educated European public, claimed that religion and morality, which were universal in all cultures, represented only a stage in societal development. The ultimate end of advanced civilizations, he argued, lay beyond religion in the realm of philosophy or a critique of the powers of reason. in their legitimate working on the data of experience. Works which seemed to imply that religious faith represented little more than an evolutionary stage, and which invited unflattering parallels to be drawn between the supernatural beliefs of savages and those of European Christians, were joined by works which stressed the subjectivity of religious experience. In a series of lectures delivered at the University of Edinburgh and afterwards published as the Varieties of Religious Experience, 1902, the American psychologist William James stressed the value of healthy-minded religious approaches in promoting individual fulfillment, but explicitly excluded the question of whether such beliefs were true as unverifiable and by implication irrelevant. The theories of the Viennese physician Sigmund Freud, whose investigations into hysteria led him to conclude that psychological disturbances or neuroses were the result of the repression of the libido by the ego, had serious implications for the Christian notion of sin as well as for traditional conceptions of the will. Freud's Totem and Taboo of 1912 through 13, which sought to account for the development of primitive religious beliefs in psychoanalytic terms, seemed to many to hold equally reductionist implications for more developed faiths. While relatively few works of the late 19th and early 20th century directly challenged the truth of Christianity or spoke of its doctrines with anything less than respect, readers might have been forgiven for imagining that once methodologically rigorous disciplines had accounted for the development of world religions and established the unconscious motivations of believers, there might be nothing left of faith to be explained. As public opinion appeared to be growing more secular, many churches tried hard to adapt to new social and intellectual trends, while others continued in the old ways, gradually reconciling themselves to the fact of smaller, although not necessarily less fervent, congregations. Since denominations could no longer rely on the pressure of social convention to fill their churches, or on the state wholeheartedly to support their activities, many began to sponsor more leisure outings, social clubs, and sporting events to compete with secular alternatives. They also began to advertise their services more aggressively and to target groups whose members seemed most alienated from the institutional churches: the young, men of all social classes, and working people. This was the quintessential age of boys' clubs, swimming baths, walking holidays, socials, and youth movements, not only in the secular but also in the Christian world. To reach the apparently indifferent and sometimes hostile working classes, many churches also made a concerted effort to accommodate criticisms offered by socialism into their presentations of the gospel message. A number of priests and religious went to live with the poor in industrial slums, sharing their hardships as they tried to follow the example of Christ. A group in the Church of England became convinced that the only solution to the social injustices of modern society lay in the creed of Christian socialism. Some Catholics, encouraged by papal social teaching in Leo XIII's encyclical Rerum Novarum, 1891, helped to set up Catholic trade unions among the French, Dutch, and Belgian factory workers, or saw a future in the spread of Christian democracy. A number of attempts to find Christian alternatives to secular forms of socialism, most of which were revived in the period between the Bolshevik Revolution and the Second World War, laid the foundations for the rise of the Labour Party in Britain and the growth of Christian democratic parties throughout the continent of Europe. But although Christian answers to the social questions of the day were to have a deep influence on post-war movements towards European unity, and despite the fact that a substantial proportion of middle-class Protestants and Catholics continued to practice their faith, Social groups and geographical areas which had become most de-Christianized over the course of the 19th century remained on the whole unresponsive to calls to return to the fold. Those who tried to make Christianity more obviously relevant to the modern world by reconciling traditional Christian teaching with fashionable intellectual currents of the day appear to have run into similar difficulties. Although liberals and socialists tended to think of the churches as obscurantist, many Christian theologians felt perfectly able to integrate the results of historical and biblical criticism, scientific and social evolutionary theories, and even socialist and ethical critiques into their understanding of the faith. The Protestant patristic scholar Adolf Harnack, for example, argued in his History of Dogma, 1886 through 89, that the Gospels offered not metaphysics, but a system of ethics which clearly endorsed the notion of universal human brotherhood. The French Catholic Alfred Loisy agreed in his The Gospel and the Church, 1902, that Christ had neither founded the Christian Church nor instituted its sacraments, but suggested that this posed no obstacle to faith in the Catholic Church, whose doctrines and sacraments had evolved over time under the protective influence of the Holy Spirit. Encouraged by Pope Leo XIII's encyclical Providentissimus Deus, 1893, which stressed the importance of biblical study for Catholics, Alfred Loisy, Maurice Blondel, Frederick von Hugel, George Tyrrell, and other prominent priests and laymen undertook to bring Catholic understandings up to date by incorporating some of the most radical conclusions of biblical criticism. Since their work ended by calling into question almost every aspect of traditional Catholic teaching, from the inspiration of the Bible to church doctrine and authority, it is not altogether surprising that the movement, which was officially described as the synthesis of all the heresies, was eventually condemned as modernism by Pius X in the decree Lamentabili, 3 July 1907, and the encyclical Pascendi, 8 September 1907. The Anglican authors of a collection of essays entitled Lux Mundi, 1889, while less radical than the modernists in their claims, caused similar controversy within the Church of England when they applied higher criticism to biblical texts and adopted popular theories of evolution and social Christian ethics, even though they maintained a firm insistence on the literalness of the Incarnation and in the reality of the supernatural. Although a number of believing Christians felt able to incorporate late 19th and early 20th century criticisms of Christianity into their understandings of it, others felt that the essence of the faith was being undermined in the process. As increasing numbers of Christians attempted to reconcile traditional theology with liberalism, biblical authority with scientism, natural ethics with Christian morality, sin with Freudian psychology, and the exclusivity of Christianity with the relativism of the new social sciences, they were apt to become idiosyncratic in the blend of beliefs which constituted their understanding of the faith. The philosopher Bertrand Russell, when sent to Gaol for promoting conscientious objection to the First World War, remembered how the prison warder asked my religion, and I replied, agnostic. He asked how to spell it, and remarked with a sigh, well, there are many religions, but I suppose they all worship the same God. Even anti-clericals could not agree as to what Christianity, as opposed to the teaching of the churches, meant, some seeing it as an endorsement and others as an obstacle to their policies. When Eleanor Marx, the daughter of Karl Marx, explained to Beatrice Potter, later Beatrice Webb, that the working classes must rid themselves of religion, since it was an immoral illusion, the prominent English Fabian could only reflect that it seemed pointless to argue with one who had no idea of the beauty of the Christian religion and read the Gospels as the gospel of damnation. The sense that pluralism was leading modern society into a babel of conflicting opinions in which no moral truth was safe and the very fabric of society might come apart was an acute worry for many Christians and non-Christians alike. It was this widespread mood of alienation and alarm which helped to win sympathy for the great collectivist movements of the 1930s, which sought to build a better world, among them fascism and communism. The Vatican's willingness to negotiate with Mussolini in the 1920s, and even albeit more reluctantly in the 1930s, like the initial welcome given to the National Socialists by most German clergy, including Pastor Martin Niemöller, who was later sent to a concentration camp for his outspoken opposition to Nazism, reflected the feeling among many Christians that communism was the greatest contemporary danger both to faith and to the security of the Christian churches. The course of the Spanish Civil War, 1936 through 39, whose widely publicized clerical and anti-clerical atrocities helped to further polarize political opinion throughout Europe, was particularly important in allying virtually all Christian churches, and many, perhaps even most, individual Christians, with the political right in the years leading up to the Second World War. When Hitler came to power in 1933, over half the German Protestant Landeskirchen chose to adopt the theological synthesis of Nazism and Christianity put forward by the so-called Deutsche Christen, German Christians. This government-supported faction within the Protestant churches, whose stated aim was to complete the Lutheran Reformation, was from the beginning accompanied by suggestions for radical reforms, including the elimination of the Old Testament, the teaching of St. Paul, and the doctrines of St. Augustine as despised Jewish elements within Christianity. Although a few German clergymen like the Catholic Cardinal Faulhaber and the Protestant theologian Karl Barth, 1886 through 1968, preached against the Nazis from the first, the overwhelming majority at the very least tolerated a party implacably opposed to communism and dedicated to restoring the economy and standing of the German nation, while many others gave the Third Reich their enthusiastic support. When, in 1933, the German Christians attempted to introduce the Aryan paragraph to exclude pastors of Jewish descent from the Prussian church, Niemöller, sensing danger, called together a pastors' emergency league of the confessional or confessing church, a body consisting of German Protestants who were worried by the interference of the government in church affairs. The neo-pagan and Erastian elements of German Christian theology became more obvious when the evangelical youth was incorporated into the Hitler Youth in 1934, and Niemöller's confessional Christians met for their first synod at Barmen in 1934, where they issued a theological declaration, largely inspired by the work of Karl Barth, which stressed the importance of the freedom of the gospel and of the grace of God. After war broke out and the confessing church was forced underground, a few notable Christian leaders in Germany, in particular Dietrich Bonhoeffer, 1906 through 45, made clear their absolute opposition to the Nazi regime. Bonhoeffer's attempts to mediate between anti-Nazi Germans and the British government through his friend George Bell, the Anglican Bishop of Chichester, were as unsuccessful as Bell's own attempts to persuade the British government to stop bombing German civilians. After being imprisoned in Buchenwald in 1943, Bonhoeffer was eventually hanged by the Gestapo at Flossenburg in 1945. The full horror of Nazi brutality made itself plain over the course of the war, not only to the Allied forces, but also to many German citizens, not least those who were the targets of its campaigns for systematic extermination, most notably Jews and people of partly Jewish descent, but also gypsies, the handicapped, homosexuals, communists, anarchists, and other groups deemed undesirable. After the Holocaust, programs of enforced euthanasia and the imprisonment of hundreds of thousands of Christians in German-occupied territories, it was less easy to defend the notion that Christian values could ever be safe in the hands of autocratic governments, however much they claimed to uphold established churches. The lesson was one which was also drawn from the widespread publicity given to the Stalinist purges of the 1930s and the annexation of virtually all of the countries of Eastern Europe at the end of the Second World War by the godless Soviet Union. After fascism was widely discredited by the experience of German Nazism and communism called into question for many by the example of Marxism-Leninism as practiced in the Soviet Union and its satellites, secular socialism and Christian democracy were left as the dominant political ideologies of Western Europe. The belief that only political democracies could safeguard liberty and that pluralism was the mark of any civilized society, an opinion which had come to be shared by believers as well as unbelievers, was enshrined in declarations of human rights, in charters which endorsed the ideal of United Nations, and in treaties which sought the integration of Europe. But because liberal democracies held it as an axiom that all forms of belief must be treated in law as if they were equally valid, Christian faith was increasingly left to fend for itself as one intellectual option among many alternatives. Partly because committed Christians appeared to be in a shrinking minority, and partly because divisions among Christians had always been felt as a scandal, ecumenical movements whose origins lay in the late 19th and early 20th centuries began to gather momentum throughout the interwar period. Protestant groups, which were particularly fragmented, had already begun to form coalitions in the 19th century through joint missionary endeavors overseas, such as those sponsored by numerous interdenominational Bible societies, and which developed into organizations like the International Missionary Council, 1910. The First Universal Christian Conference on Life and Work, 1925, which aimed to promote Christian values in political, economic, and social life, was soon matched by a World Conference on Faith and Order, 1927, which aimed to pursue the goal of Christian unity through theological rapprochements. At conferences held in Edinburgh and Oxford in 1937, the Faith and Order and Life and Work movements agreed to join together in a single World Council of Churches, whose constitution was drafted in 1938, but only put into practice in 1948, as part of a popular movement of the revival of Christian values which followed the Second World War. That all Christian churches would immediately unite after 4 centuries of mutual hostility was never very likely. Increased tolerance and greater sympathy among Protestants and Catholics as they emerged from their respective denominational ghettos was nevertheless a marked development of the second half of the 20th century. The Catholic Church, which had seemed most alien to the other Christian denominations through its claims to special authority and its separate liturgical language, took steps to modernize its teaching, liturgy, and organization at the Second Vatican Council, 1962 through 65. It also began its cautious approach to the World Council of Churches, first through a joint working group established in 1965, and then in 1968 by accepting full membership in the Faith and Order Commission. The increasing sense that traditionalist Christians had much in common with each other was made particularly acute by the social and sexual revolutions of the 1960s and 1970s, which tended to divide Christians from non-Christians over especially contentious ethical issues like divorce, homosexuality, and abortion, although the equally explosive moral and theological questions surrounding birth control and the role of women in both church and society tended to arouse as much controversy within Christian denominations. Despite the confident predictions of many liberals of the 1960s and 1970s that Christianity, evidently in serious decline, would soon be as defunct as the religion of the ancient Greeks, Western Europe not only continued to contain many believing Christians, but also remained at least latently Christian in many other respects. Not only did most people continue to believe in God, however vaguely and sometimes heretically defined, but many non-believers or semi-believers continued to wish to marry in church, to have their children baptized, and to feel that a church burial was somehow more reverent than a secular cremation. Even pervasive unofficial non-Christian creeds like socialism, popular psychology, and scientism bore a distinct family resemblance to traditional Christianity in their moral earnestness, their claims to universality, and their hopes for human redemption. As the familiar joke had it, even atheists could be clearly divided into Protestant atheists and Catholic atheists. From about the 1980s, as socialist movements appeared to be losing their self-confidence, and the progressivist optimism associated with technological, medical, and material advances of the long, post-war economic boom, and particularly the 1960s, seemed to be running out of steam, there were also distinct signs of Christian revival. These could be sensed in a number of ways: in the spread of charismatic movements among the youth, both Protestant and Catholic; in the sales of popular theological works, like those of best-selling authors C.S. Lewis and Pierre Teilhard de Chardin; in at least occasionally less hostile appraisals of the churches in the media; and in widespread admiration for at least a few contemporary religious figures, among them Mother Teresa of Calcutta and Archbishop Desmond Tutu of South Africa. At the same time, publicity given in the West to liberation theology helped to remove the stigma of right-wing politics with which the Christian churches had come to be associated by the political left. For Christians who remained fully committed to their faith at the end of the 20th century, the sea change which had taken place throughout Western Europe in the role of the institutional churches in theological developments, and above all in the formation of an instinctively skeptical and relativist outlook, had a number of important effects. Thoughtful Christians, like thoughtful agnostics, could no longer unquestioningly accept the faith or anti-faith of their parents. As C.S. Lewis mused in the 1940s, the ancient man approached God, or even the gods, as the accused person approaches his judge. In modern times, however, the roles are reversed. He is the judge. God is in the dock. He is quite a kindly judge. If God should have a reasonable defense for being the God who permits war, poverty, and disease, he is ready to listen to it. The trial may even end in God's acquittal, but the important thing is that man is on the bench and God is on the dock. God is in the dock. By the end of the 20th century, the primacy of individual conscience had been raised to a point where it appeared to overshadow the older virtue of obedience to church teaching. The onus of proof, which had once rested on the religious skeptic, now seemed to lie with the conservative believer. But although this change of emphasis made Christians far more vulnerable to shifts in prevailing secular opinion, it also meant that faith, once accepted or painfully reappropriated, was arguably more likely to last. It seems absurd to presume that there could ever have been a time when the entire population of Europe would spontaneously and wholeheartedly have chosen to commit itself to Christianity, had it been presented with a series of distinct and mutually contradictory ethical and philosophical systems, and been free of any legal pressure or social incentive to choose only one. Despite the prevalence of romantic fictions about the European past, there was never an age of perfect Christian faith. To those who, noting an overall decline in church attendance from the 1880s to the present day, feel certain that the territory which was once called Christendom will one day be fully atheist, Christians might well reply that faith, never universal, has been known to survive in even less promising conditions than those of the present. This ends chapter 12.